Welcome to NICE International Women Summit 2020. NICE International Women Summit 2020 is organized to bring together the dynamic women experts in the field of international relations from around the world. It is the first women summit organized by NICE in very short time. At the time when there is flood and is the fact that there are enough excellent women experts in the field of international relations, foreign policy, and security issues. We have around 71 experts from 12 countries, including Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, the US, the UK, Russia, Armenia, the Philippines, Switzerland, Indonesia. There are 10 sessions which is taken place at 2 Zoom rooms simultaneously. This is the 7th session of the summit. It will be moderated by Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari. Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, Sahid Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi, and is an associate editor of China Report, Journal of East Asian Studies since 2016. She holds a PhD in Chinese Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She was a visiting scholar at the Shanghai Institute of Global and Area Studies at Hamburg, Germany. Thank you, Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sumitra. Thank you for introducing me and also laying out the session, as it were, the finer points of the session. So I welcome all the panelists. I see some familiar faces. Hi, Anna. And
Hi,
it's been a long time
long
since
time.
we all met, and it's really very nice for us all to be having this kind of conversation together on a platform on very topical themes. And I think one of the most important aspects of this entire discourse and dialogue which is being created is the fact that we are, as South Asian scholars, as South Asian women scholars, we are registering our voices and creating a discursive space for various kind of nuanced themes, and creating conversations which will perhaps continue over a longer period of time, creating synergies and creating aspects of cooperation, aspects of co-traveling kind of academic these topics. So without taking away much time, I am told that all the panelists are there except for one. So we hope that she joins somewhere in between. So I'll begin with Shraddha. Is Shraddha here? Yes.
Yes, I am here.
Yes. Shraddha, I'm just trying to figure out. Okay. Yeah, Shraddha is an assistant professor in Maghreb University, and her topic of presentation is going to be local government in Pakistan, prey of political parasites. So welcome, Shraddha, and please begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first, I would like to pay thanks to NICE to give me opportunity to speak on this platform. And my topic is local government of Pakistan, the prey of political parasites. I'll begin say the importance of local government and the fact that power has the tendency to concentrate underlines the rationale of all the discussions over decentralization of power, the need of decentralization of power. It is the local government system which have become very important amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and they have become the frontline agencies to connect to the people, whether it is the task of delivery of public services, basic public services, and spreading awareness among the masses, or management of the crisis at local level. It is the local government institutions which are inevitable for the good governance in any country. So it is the grassroots level political leadership in a country, and strengthens the democratic system of a country. And it is a platform which brings the leadership closer to the people, and it improves the decision making system by making it more inclusive, and it ensures effectiveness in the public delivery system by making it transparent and accountable. However, Pakistan was not able to reap all these benefits of local government system, mainly because of the weak structure of the local government system. And due to historic reasons, the local government system in Pakistan have been utterly failed to deliver governance at the ground level. And Pakistan presents a unique case where the local government system was promoted by, like in the name of democracy, it was promoted by the undemocratic regime at the center. The first government system took place in the time of during the rule of during the military rule of General Ayub Khan, in the name of basic democracy, the model of basic democracy. And the last major experiment took place during the military rule of General Pervez Musharraf, in the name of genuine democracy in place of sham democracy. So it was a contradiction in itself that an unrepresentative government and the military rule is talking about the local government system in the name of strengthening the hands of democracy. And it has been alleged that the military has done so. Military has taken the form of experiment at the local level, mainly for the political legitimacy and cultivating pro-military elites, as well as for building the building blocks of loyal political agents. And Ishaq Ahmad has low government for the central government. So it has been unfortunate in case of Pakistan that the development of local government system could not take spontaneously, and it could not take its spontaneous course like in other countries. And it has hampered the growth of local government system in Pakistan. As far as the structure of local government system in Pakistan is concerned, it is the three-tier model with Tehsil, with Union Council at the bottom, and Tehsil Council, and at the upper level is the District Council. And it was built on the relics of devolution of power plan during General Pervez Musharraf. So if we talk about the Constitution of Pakistan of 1973, the reference of local government system one Article 30 and Article 140A. Article 32 prescribes that the state will promote the development of local government system composing of elected representatives of areas, and in these institutions special representation will be given to women peasants and workers. And one Article 140A was added by added through the 18th amendment, and it has imposed the responsibility to develop local government institutions to the provinces. And it states that the provinces shall by law establish the local government institutions and devolve administrative, financial, and political responsibilities to the local institutions. So it is apparent through the Constitution, the responsibility of development of local government institutions have been given to the provinces. So after the end of the military rule of General Pervez Musharraf, Pakistan has entered a golden phase of democracy when the two civilian regimes completed their tenure and handed over to the third civilian rule. And the question is whether this golden phase of democracy will strengthen, will provide some trust to the local government institutions, which have been totally dependent on the provinces for the devolution of authority, responsibilities, and resources. Article the 18th amendment was 18th amendment was held historic sense devolved power to from the center to the provinces, but it stopped there and it did not devolve power to the local level, and the responsibility was imposed on the provinces. But provinces have been very reluctant in promoting local government institutions, as they see them as the relics of the past, relics of the military rule, and because of that they are very distrustful of all these institutions. They think that they are the elites nourished by the military rule. So it has been unfortunate in case of Pakistan. After that, I will say that the new government, the recent government led by Imran Khan, is talking about the new system, new local government system in Pakistan, and system, the three-tier model will be replaced by the two-tier model, and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province and Punjab province are set to launch this new local government system, and under this the head of the local government will be directly elected, as well as the union council will be replaced by the tehsil council, and there will be six type of local government, and it is the question appears that will this new model, this again Pakistan is talking about the new model, so will this new model be able to foster confidence among the local government institutions? The question, the answer is not so clear, because nobody is talking about the importance of constitutional state, the nourishment of these local government institutions have been left on the provinces. And if we give if these local government institutions are constitutional recognized, it will strengthen the hands of these institutions, and it will make them more autonomous, and financially also they will be the resources may be they may be given certain resources in the constitution itself, so that they are not dependent at the electoral elites at the provinces level. However, it is very difficult. The picture is not very optimistic, because it is for giving them the constitutional status, there is a need of making consensus among.
You have 1 minute
Okay, ma'am. Of making consensus among the political elites, among diverse political parties, which is not very optimistic in case of Pakistan. So it is in the form of future how these local government institutions will be strengthened in Pakistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shraddha. I'll request all the participants to kindly mute their mics, one, and two, to all my panelists, kindly keep to the time limit of 10 minutes, and if at all you need to wind up in another couple of minutes, I'll sort of just point it out to you. So I can see that all the panelists have joined us now. Any which way, I'm going to just follow what the organizers said. So they said that the second to go would be invite Dr. Anand to speak about, on the issue of para-diplomacy and rise of Asia, and engagements to build smart and powerful cities. I welcome Anand from Amity.
Good evening, everyone. So it's 4 o'clock, and I have chosen a topic called para-diplomacy in Asia. So it seems to be like I would look forward into positive side of foreign policy while we have so many conflicts and distress going on. But para-diplomacy always sounds very positive and kind of very accelerating. Now, the idea is to look at just Asia. As of now, I'm just researching in detail on it. But then, as far as I see, in 2020, para-diplomacy is no more a choice. It is an essential prerequisite for foreign policy. One cannot say that we have to depend on national governments. Even our own government, since 2014, our Prime Minister has focused and rather, state governments their role in foreign policy. So even right now today, I've been engaging in a lot of entrepreneurial workshops, and then Atmanirbhar Bharat is becoming the startup smart build-up proposition, and every university, colleges, corporates are all looking at Atmanirbhar Bharat and few programs. Everyone is doing their bit and part in micromanagement and participation para-diplomacy. I'll start sharing the screen, a small 5 to 6 slides, not much. So just let me do the slideshow. Okay, I'm sure it's visible right now. I think I jumped up for the first page, which is para diplomacy in Asia. I'm looking at how smart and sustainable and powerful cities are being made. Like understand the diplomacy, para diplomacy is something, though it doesn't have a lot of importance given it to it on a formal note, but yet it has gained a lot of prominence. So equivalent to public diplomacy, para diplomacy is gaining ground. So we have a lot of states taking part all over the world. Rather in Asia Pacific, the new research reports for past 2017, 16, 18, 19, all reports are suggesting that how Asia Pacific is becoming the most place, and the growth is growing in Asia Pacific. Population is increasing. Then it is becoming more populous, more digital literacy. All of this there. So I'll just put forward the fact that para diplomacy has become the center stage in foreign policy. And if you're looking at foreign policy in a federal note, because we cannot depend on only national governments, because we know political standoffs always are there. Like India, China is at China also has a lot of trade relations. One Belt, One Road initiative is going all across South Asia and every other parts of Asia. So how China is also looking at para diplomacy, and it has had a lot of successful models. So looking at how foreign policy is federalized under the arrangement of para diplomacy, so state governments, and rather if you look at how municipal level governments and mayors and all local decentralized governments can take part. So now the dependency on central and national governments is reducing with 2019-20. And basically the agents of change are now all of them. We are talking of decentralized government in foreign policy. So we are not depending on just the central government. And the purpose are, of course, leaving aside some basic parameters like defense and foreign policy, but they're opening up to foreign policy initiative, but in economics, culture, in digital technology, energy, climate change. So many areas up, and so very well. So the processes is the people to people energies. Though para diplomacy does not always engage national governments, it does engage the national governments, but more so it can look at civilian people, civil people also engaging in this kind of arrangements and significant role that they can play. I've just put forward that, how cities, we are all becoming metropolitan cities. Most of the population in Asia Pacific are living in cities, mega cities, metropolis. And these mega cities are also very populous. They have a high population, they're very risky, they have a high rate of climate shocks, they have a high rate of energy shocks. So many things are happening in these cities, but almost every population is moving forward to living in cities. So there are a lot of, Asia Pacific, there are a lot of initiatives led by a lot of, you can say, the credit agencies or investor agencies and economic setups. And some populators at how Mumbai is a place in India which has experienced in 1992 almost in the Hubble project in terms of the first para diplomacy effort that it has made. Though we give the credit in India to Chandrababu Naidu, unofficially he is the first one who did lead the para diplomacy, but then the whole popular movement was taken over by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and he actually accelerated the concept of para diplomacy. So the smart city concept is not just India's alone project, it is the world over project. But since I'm looking at only Asia, I'm looking at how Asia is every single moment talking about smart, sustainable cities. And para-diplomacy is one of the key most features that they have to bring in. Since I've told there is no choice now, it's only to be there. But there are so many aspirational cities, you take away almost every South Asian country is now aspiring to become a smart city. Dhaka, Sri Lanka had some a big building had few days, a few months back. And everyone in India, there are a lot of cities, Kerala, Hyderabad, we have then Andhra Pradesh, we have Tamil Nadu now, we have Odisha. So everyone is making para-diplomacy initiatives and connecting. The state governments are directly connecting for investors, and they are making investor summits are becoming very regular in India. So some of the facts that I've given just to, the reports that have come out, so just to enlighten that how Asia is becoming the second fastest growing region. So para-diplomacy has to be looked at. And this is a list of figure of taking from a report, the top 10 countries that people will look at. But India nowhere figures out in there. There are limitations that India still has, but India is keeping on saying that this is what we're looking at in terms of growth, smart city, but India still lags behind a lot of factors which will come in the next few slides. I've just put on two just examples. One is where the Korean representative ambassadors have come to Orissa and they are trying to invest. So there are many countries from South Korea who actually came and in 2019 met their Orissa government and kind of proposed a lot of projects starting from infrastructure to industry to kind of energy to even media. So there are so many projects that they are thinking of. And then we have always Kerala as an initiator. So it was from Sarja, there were people who had come and how they're proposing new changes through a para-diplomacy method. Who are the facilitators? I've just analyzed that these are the people. We cannot look, these are any one of them minusing their role would not be a better model. We have central government, state government, the mayors and municipal leaders, bodies, corporates, investors, the ambassadors, the foreign office. A lot of research papers does enlighten the fact that border states needs to make more initiative in para-diplomatic efforts because a lot of like Northeast Act East policy, we cannot, diminish the fact that Northeast Act is being reinvented. This is how Northeastern states like Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, Assam, they're all trying to conduct investor summits. Looking at populous state, all the states within India and Asia, those who are very population high index, they are all looking at how to collaborate with other Asian countries or Pacific countries, and para-diplomacy is what they're adopting. What are the factors basically? In any initiative in para-diplomacy, what we see basically is autonomy. We have the case example of Macau region, and there are few research papers that has been published on how Macau can be an example for India. Because when Macau was free, and Macau and Goa comparison goes in, when Macau got the freedom, China did relax Macau with a lot of own autonomy powers in order to conduct their own businesses, not exactly in defense and foreign policy, but exactly in culture and casino and then technology and then infrastructure. So Macau lives as the most role model diplomacy, and that's why Macau to have today the highest growth in casinos more than Las Vegas, and even for that matter in tourism. So technology tools are very important because that is where the new collaborations are happening. And any para-diplomatic efforts cannot go with liberal economic policies. India already has it, but India needs to work on autonomy and other dimensions like cooperative federalism, which the center and state union state relation is always at conflict. So cooperative federalism is a very critical aspect. Now, let me just, this is my last slide, and just that I'll just put forward. There are a few reports only I've mentioned, but the idea is that India has to participate, and the central government cannot just talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat and make everyone self-reliant by putting the onus on them. The central government has to relax some of the laws, procedures, processes. The central government cannot say just because we cannot do it anymore, the states will do it. I think hand-holding also stay and also allowing them whenever the proposal comes, allowing them to pass the proposals and facilitate the relationship between the center, state, and the other countries. So a lot of initiatives are there. So you can see the since 2017, Vibrant Gujarat, Punjab, Kerala, even in Assam, then there is Team India, there was state kind of team, everything but China-India relation in para-diplomacy is very significant. And rather to be very surprising, the Ahmedabad-China relationship in terms of many of the agreements signed have been there. So one thing is that India-China conflict, political, one thing is India-China better relation. So I'll stop with this, not taking much time. Thank you for this. I don't want to exceed the time. Later we can do with question answers. Thank you, thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Anna. You've been bang on time, so thanks a lot for that.
Thank you so much.
I'm also questions they have for all the panelists as and when they are presenting. You can type it out in the chat box, and at the end of the presentation by all the panelists, I'll make it a point to see the questions for each of them, and I'll try to ask them to address to as many as possible. So next in the queue is Dr. Smita Tiwari, who is going to present on Afghanistan amidst political instability and pandemic. She's a fellow at Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. Welcome, Smita, and kindly unmute yourself. Yeah, thank you. So I'll not take away any time from any of the panelists. Just go ahead straight forward with your presentation, and we hope to see a lot of questions at the end. So we'll try to be as precise as possible. So you have again 10 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Well, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
And thank you, organizers. I'll try to keep in mind this 10 minutes. Well, I may sound repetitive, but I have to say this, and I have to congratulate NICE team, and particularly Pramod and his team for coming with this wonderful initiative of Women Summit. And I'm truly delighted to be part of this. So thank you once again. And here I start. My topic is Afghanistan amidst political instability and the pandemic. So we all know that just a second. Yeah, the world has taken to be as a hostage by a pandemic called COVID-19, and South Asia is a region which has long back been predicted by WHO that it is going to be an hotspot for this pandemic. Though it was not as alarming as it is at present. However, it was long been predicted. But yes, at present we see that the cases in South Asia has gone very much high. And if we look at particularly at the Afghanistan, at present in Afghanistan, 36,000 of COVID-19 cases with the fatal number of around 1,200. So this is not huge, they're not less also. This is something to be serious about. There is a serious requirement. There is a requirement for a serious effort to deal with this pandemic. But yes, it is also alarming in Afghanistan, because if we see Afghanistan is a place where the population bulge is very high in comparison to the other countries in South Asia. And also if we look at the medical facilities and infrastructure in Afghanistan, it is very weak. That extremely vulnerable. While the whole world is engaged and busy in dealing and finding best possible ways to deal with the pandemic, Afghanistan is still struggling with its old challenges, which has kept its peace elusive, and it has affected its peace and its stability for a longer period of time. So that is an irony we see in Afghanistan. What are the challenges and problem in Afghanistan? I'll have just a brief look. My aim of this presentation is to understand is the various efforts that are being taken by the national government in Afghanistan or at the regional level or the international organization, are they going to bring peace in any near soon? Sometimes hope rises, but usually it's short-lived. Yes, at present, because peace, I know Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, peace has long been elusive, but I will disrupt the last. But at present, if we see the two parallel government, we start with the national government, because after the election, we all know that the result was not confirming, and the adamancy of the two parties gave rise to the formation of two parallel governments. So this formation of two parallel government is really a thing of concern, because President Ashraf Ghani and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah, the two parties, if they are heading the government, that means there will be two head of the state, there will be two cabinets, there will be two division of the geography, and everything will be divided in terms of leadership and governance. So in future, my point is, in future, when a talk starts between Taliban and government of Afghanistan, this not so united or a parallel government will really give a bad impression, not only impression, but it will also put Kabul on the back foot. It will affect its interest while dealing with the Afghanistan. That is one of the very important. Secondly, recently the United States has signed a deal with the Taliban after almost negotiating for a year. So after the deal, the major conditions, the more important conditions, I'll just point out. Number one, the US agreed to withdraw completely within the 14 months of time period. In return, Taliban will not allow its territory, whatever is under its control, to use against US by any territorial group, any faction within the Taliban. This is. And secondly, the Taliban also start negotiation with the government of Afghanistan during March or April. Some time frame was given. So this is the broader provision agreement. However, it gave a hope that after this deal is being signed, something may change. But after 3 months, we see that nothing has changed. The massive attacks, on government officials, the massive attack on ANDSF forces and various establishment by US itself, by Taliban, it shows that they both are showing, though they are on lips and on paper saying that they are committed to the provisions, however, the behavior of the two teams says that it is not so. Even US is targeting the Taliban outfits at many times. So there have been other peace deals also. The tragedy of Afghanistan is that the problem is one, but there are solutions, so many solutions. We have, the whole entire world is trying, but one peace deal, Afghanistan itself, that is called Heart of Asia. However, nothing very concrete and conducive have come out of it. Another peace initiative was started by Russia in Moscow. There were 3-4 rounds of talks and a lot of discussions, but again, nothing very substantive conclusion could come out from that negotiations. Now, the government of Taliban and the government of Afghanistan and Taliban, these two entities, it seems very difficult to bring these two different entities on the same table. Why? Because first of all, there are very much differences in their understanding, approach, and belief, that what do they believe in. Firstly, Taliban do not believe in the constitution of Afghanistan and consider itself as a sole representative of Islamic Emirate, which the government of Afghanistan denies. So the basic demarcation and differences, differentiate point they to come to the same table. Further, Taliban has also gained wider acceptance in society. We see that in 2001, when US attacked in Taliban, it was almost got destroyed. But after 2004, it resurrected and strengthened itself. And the new Taliban is that the old Taliban was very strict, very harsh regarding certain living conditions, whereas the new Taliban is little more at ease with certain issues like watching movies or songs or little rights given to women. These sort of things are, these sort of changes in Taliban's approach has made it acceptable at a wider level in Afghanistan. According to some report, almost the Taliban covers almost around 40% of Afghanistan. So this is the situation. Now we talk about the global actors, how they see it. So the US, as I mentioned, that US has been the prime actor in Afghanistan since 2001, and recently it has signed a peace deal with it, but nothing major change is looking. And it is also worrisome that if US withdraws completely, who is going to fill the vacuum? That is one question.
1 minute. Hello? You have 1 minute.
Okay, just I'm binding it up. Then Russia is there. Russia is also feels sidelined because of it has not been invited in the many peace negotiations initiated by the US. Then China is there for its own interest, which is political as well as securitization, because the China's Uyghur province is adjacent to Afghanistan, and China doesn't want any radicalization to touch the Uyghur province. Then Pakistan, obvious region. I think we can take it in a Q&A session. And India, there have been that India is very uncomfortable with the peace deal that US and Taliban has signed, for the obvious reason that India has always engaged with India has strengthened and multi-layer engagement with the government of Afghanistan, and this Taliban, the many senior officials in Taliban has been trained in Pakistan, so for the very obvious reason. But the US chief executive who came to India, who came to South Asia region and said that India should directly engage with Taliban. I think I don't see it happening in a very formal setting, because my point is that what India would achieve by engaging with Taliban, which it does not achieve by deepening its relationship with the existing government. And secondly, even if it take place, it will be in very informal setting, it will be under the table. So nothing is going to be in a formal happening in formal setting. My conclusion is that I do bright future in coming years, because the Taliban stature, uncompromising position, its stance on women rights, Taliban's views on minorities, its non-acceptance of constitution, these are some of the very basic issues that will always be there, and until and unless these issues are taken care of, I do not think peace is anywhere near the Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Smita. Since we have the first speaker with us, can I just ask if Jigyasa is available? I can see her name there, but
Yes.
Jigyasa, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. So, Jigyasa, would you like to go? I can't see you. Yeah. All right.
Okay,
Jigyasa, you're going to present on understanding the nature of recent non-traditional security threats across the globe. Welcome, Jigyasa. You have 10 minutes. Please begin with your presentation. Yeah.
so my paper basically attempts to identify certain gaps in the current debates and the policies that that needs to develop a better approach towards understanding violent extremism. So my paper will be limiting itself to the security perspective, because there are many perspectives that could be taken in and factored in to understand the whole concept of violent extremism. I'll be sticking to the terminology of extremism and radicalization, because this is something which would be serving the purpose of my paper. And it will be divided into 4 particular parts for the presentation purpose. So firstly, I'll just try to break the whole title. Firstly, what is meant by the non-traditional security? As opposed to the traditional security perspective, it simply looks at the non-military takes states, but it also takes people in the tertiary. For example, issues of climate change, terrorism, and recently COVID. It needs a multi-perspective and a multiple-level approach. It doesn't, and it cannot be simply resolved by the state. We need cooperation at regional and multiple levels. Now, why I'm saying that uh, it's a threat across the globe. So if we see the whole trajectory of extremist cases, for example, the extremism, hate crimes, radicalization across the globe, they are increasing in number as well as they are spreading across the territory. If we take the reverse trajectory, for example, firstly, New Zealand, very recent case. There have been no such cases in New Zealand till now, but Christchurch attack was one of the cases. Then if we talk about, for example, Sri Lanka, there was Easter attack. Before that, basically having attacks in Sri Lanka, but now it has taken over by some other organizations too. Then there are many examples, for example, El Paso attack and other examples. So now, simply moving to the understanding of extremism and radicalization. There are certain problems in the whole understanding that we witness today. Initially, the traditional perspective that came after 9/11, the whole debate that started in US. It looks at countering violent extremism, that is CVE, and preventing violent extremism, that is PVE. These two approaches came across. But there were certain fault lines. For example, it specifically looked at certain groups, for example, Muslim groups. It used certain terminology, for example, Islamic ideology, and these were the main focus. Now, gradually, what we are seeing that there is a broadening or poison plan of action which was adopted, it actually looked at the civil society and how we could actually move towards preventing these measures. So these are the changes coming up, but still there are certain problems. For example, the whole terminology that has been adopted till now. Across the state, there are different terms, for example, hate crimes, radicalization, extremism, hateful extremism, violent extremism. All these um, are adopted and used very liberally, which actually frames the whole debate very vague. That's one thing. Secondly, when we talk about the legal laws, all the whole structure of states, how they're actually countering these measures, they don't have a particular law. For example, in case of India, when we talk about mob lynching cases, India do not have a particular law for mob lynching. It has a law for hate speech. They have been, for example, Supreme Court because there have been multiple cases, but nothing has been done till now. Now, if we look at the collection of data, there have been multiple methodologies adopted by different organizations. Firstly, there are states that do collect it, but again, their definition is very different. Now, there are states which just do not consider, adopting or collecting data. For example, India again. Now there are multiple cases, for example, not reporting the act or simply reporting it, but not identifying it in a particular manner. So these are the cases. So many non-state institutions, for example, NGOs like Amnesty International, have been trying to report and collect the data, but even though they have also not completely, able to collect it. So these are some of the problems. Now, if we look at like now, this part will specifically limit to the gaps, like what are the misunderstanding the current would say the whole concept of terrorism is church attack. In that case, do we or can we actually say that yes, the organization that influenced the person, Patrick, was a terrorist organization? No, we cannot identify a particular group as terrorist organization. So if we are limiting ourselves to a particular terrorist group, so that could be a problematic thing. One, two. Uh, Majorly, the debate has been surrounded by certain key understanding, that is, if a particular group is marginalized or discriminated against, then this group would be, actually be very comfortable in adopting these measures. Like they would be the main participant in violent extremism. But is this the actual case? No. For example, again, if we talk about Christchurch attack, it was a person who was belonging to a majority group, that was white supremacists, basically the whites. So it's not specifically, or we should say, it's not limiting to a certain minority groups. Even majority groups are participating in it, and in the recent cases, they are the major perpetrators. Now, if we look at other, I would say, certain myths, it has been said that a person, specifically a youth, which has been radicalized, that person, if that person is not having proper education, skills, or employment, so these are certain frustrating factors that has been uh, that has been helping in the radicalization process. But is this the case? No. There have been many cases where we can see easily that the person has been well employed and well educated, but still they're actually going for radicalized measures. And if we particular document, for example, the recent UN 2015 plan of action against violent extremism, it talks about these three things. So again, a problematic thing. It talks about democracy, that in democracy it won't be happening. It talks about violent extremism conducive to terrorism only. It talks about terrorist organizations such as Al Qaeda, ISIS, I'm sorry, and it talks about preventive measures, for example, providing education to you. Now, what?
Brother, you have 1 minute.
Yes, ma'am. So
Uh,
again, what is missing? Firstly, a fear. We see that the minority as well as the majority group, the perpetrator as well as the victims, they both have one thing in common. They both fear something and they both state themselves as the victim. So the victimhood is actually common in both the cases. Now, if we look at the weapons which has been used, firstly, in Western states, this has mainly been guns, but in India, because obviously so is widely available. But in many other cases, we see that even a normal car or a truck or a simple knife would be used. So again, a problem. Now, if we see the place, it could be a road, it could be a mall, it could be a shop as well. Now, if we see there is an acceptance of violence, for example, now it has become comfortable to action. Why? Because of media. We all know that media is a medium, but again, it has added something that I call it an element of fun, which actually makes the whole uh, violent act very much acceptable. So these three things are the things that we need to look at. And if I talk about some of the recommendations broadly, we need a systemic interdisciplinary approach. When we need security studies, we also need neurosciences to understand the whole concept. Secondly, we also need an evidence-based study. This is what we definitely need. And again, which no policy document talks about, is the political motivation, providing immunity to the perpetrators. Maybe New Zealand, the whole statement of "they are us" could be taken as an example how it could be done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jigyasa. So I can see on screen both Hoymanti and Anjali. I think Hoymanti, you can go first if that is all right. Yeah, please unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah. So Dr. Hoymanti is going to present on mapping human security in Bangladesh, an overview of climate change induced risks and its consequences. Hoymanti works at NIICE, our host. Welcome, Hoymanti. I'm going to welcome you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So without taking any time from you, please begin with your presentation. You have minutes to lag as before. Yeah.
Sure, okay. Um, Good evening, everyone. This has been a very stimulating session so far, and I'm very delighted to be able to present my perspective on non-traditional security issues and its human security aspect vis-a-vis Bangladesh. NTS is not an exclusive problem of Bangladesh, but to many countries around the world. But in the context of this presentation, I will be talking about Bangladesh, firstly because Bangladesh is a victim of non-traditional security related issues emanating from climate change, which is causing serious human security threats in the country. Often referred to as ground zero for climate change, Bangladesh is recognized as one of the most disaster susceptible regions of the world, exposed to dire ramifications brought by climate change loss and damage so much that the impacts on human security are manifold. Bangladesh is a small deltaic region which is dominated by floodplains and a low-lying coastal terrain prone to acute weather episodes due to its geophysical positioning and its topography, added with other problems of high population density, high levels of poverty, and overwhelming dependence of nature and resources of the country. It is monsoon now, and heavy rainfall and swelling rivers have flooded many areas of Bangladesh. As recently as 14 July, that is barely 5 days back, Al Jazeera reported with a very cogent headline saying a third of Bangladesh is underwater after heavy rains and floods. A third is actually a huge area, especially for a small country, a number of 1.5 million people who are being affected at this point of time. But why is it alarming when we all knew the kind of nuisances monsoon brings to us? We are particularly alarmed because rainfall, cyclones, floods, etc., are no longer singularly associated as as a normal natural disaster. A parallel rationale is strongly associated to this, what we know as climate change. And climate change is leading to escalating global warming and erratic climatic behavior. We all have a fair idea of climate change, yet I will touch upon it very briefly. If you look at the average increased temperature anomaly, it looks like as if the trend of global warming goes back to the 1900s. But the upward trend of rising temperature really began to kick in since the 1980s onwards. but it took on this issue. A primary reason for the escalating global warming is the human-induced expansion of greenhouse gas emissions. In its fifth assessment report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is the IPCC, in collaboration with the UNDP, concluded that there is more than 95% probability that human activities over the past 50 years have warmed our planet by producing toxic greenhouse gases, causing much of the observed increase in Earth's temperature. Burning of fossil fuels like coal, gas, oil for electricity, industrial purpose, heat generation, and transportation, all that we use to symbolize our modern advanced society, is the primary source of human generated emissions. A second major source is the deforestation of carbon into the air. The very reason for mentioning the above issues are only because every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and all that we are facing today are interrelated. Like one cause is leading to another effect. Hence, it is imperative at this point we talk about, every time we talk about the problem, we first definitely talk about the cause of the problem. There are a number of factors that are involved in human-induced impacts of climate change on the rivers and the water systems. Firstly, global warming is one of the climate change effects. It is excessively heating the Earth's temperature, causing thermal expansion, glacial melt, loss of primary ice sheets like the Greenland, Antarctica, including our own Himalayan glacier, which is 1/3 of ice, snow in. Bangladesh is the largest river delta located in the Bay of Bengal. Two large rivers, that is the Ganges and Brahmaputra, receives water from the Himalayas and flows through the country from north to south, emptying in the Bay of Bengal. It is particularly important to mention this as well because Bangladesh is a low riparian country that receives water from the Himalayas, and any amount of excessive water that enters the country acts as a negative. It puts a negative impact in the country. So heavy rain swells the two main rivers, as I mentioned, that flows through India and Bangladesh, but overflows causing floods. Another problem is the rising sea, which is also due to the climate change. In recent years, global exhilarating. This marks the beginning of a trend that could dramatically change much of the world's coastline and the contours of the map as we know it today. The losses can be and will be immense. There will be places that won't survive, and several countries will go underwater. And this is where it specifically concerns Bangladesh. Second is the impact of flooding, and third are the cyclones arising from the Bay of Bengal in the south, which will become more intense and deadly in the days to come. The consequences are intricately interrelated to the society, like flood that renders people homeless, causes food insecurity, water insecurity, loss of property and agricultural land, and loss of income opportunities. Then there is cyclones and flooding that the cyclones and flooding air damages agricultural land and the availability of drinking water. We are vulnerable to sea rise, coastal flooding, and also general flooding. It increases soil salinity and reduces availability of water. Climate change will have an impact on the ecosystem. It will detriment the Sundarbans, increase the soil erosion, and destroy soil quality. Now, this brings us to the issue of migration, internal migration. Loss of land and damage of property is one of the primary reasons of internal migration in Bangladesh. Riverbank erosion singularly has decimated millions of lives or destroyed shelters permanently, causing large-scale migration, creating extra pressure in the urban areas. At least 2,200 hectares of land is believed to be lost in the year 2018 by riverbank erosion. Estimated 2,000 people arrive in Dhaka every day, which doubles during the monsoon. So there is a huge problem of mushrooming growth of urban slums and low quality of life by these people. And there's an added extra pressure on Dhaka that has made the city extremely suffocating to live in, and there's an added pressure on the landmark itself of the city. Our economy is agricultural based, agriculture based, where two-thirds of the population is directly or indirectly dependent on agricultural labor. Agriculture is a climate responsive sector. So it reacts to altered temperatures like rainfall patterns, droughts, and floods that govern the yielding of the crop. So irregular crop.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. Irregular crop yield is likely to give food insecurity. This is a very wide topic of discussion and cannot be done. I can't do justice within 10 minutes. So I will quickly wrap up here by concluding that rising sea level due to climate change is an old concern for Bangladesh. It was predicted years ago that our country would be one of the first victims of submergence in the rapidly warming weather. But can we save ourselves from this damage? Because we cannot engineer ourselves out of sea level rise. So research has revealed that sea level could rise by 85 to 140 centimeters by the year 2100, which is nearly double the previous estimates made. And it is a serious danger to the 160 million people. Actions that must be taken with cooperation of the developed nations before it's too late, because even a 1 meter sea level rise will 18% of the coastal areas and destroy at least 27 million people's lives. Yeah, done.
Okay. Thank you, Hoymanti. I'll invite now Anjali, who's going to speak again on Bangladesh, albeit on a much broader canvas of things, as it were. She's going to speak on shaping of Bangladesh's neighborhood foreign policy making, changing trends and policies. Welcome, Anjali. She is at JNU.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, NICE, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak here on the platform. As you know, my topic is foreign policy, foreign policy. So I would like to start by arguing that when we speak of foreign policy making, it has to be a mix of organization and a mix of spontaneity. The aims for the foreign policy making have to be large. The supply of inputs has to be from the core leadership, and the process has to have a sustained interaction with a bureaucratic politics of its own. So the foreign policy making process also has its own bureaucratic politics. And what Jürgen Habermas has called that every knowledge system has its own interests. In the same way, the foreign policy making is also based on the practical interests of its own. Over the years, Bangladesh's foreign policy has not been reactionary. It has not been dependent on the impulses of the leaders. There has been a consistency in its foreign policy. The country, think of a small states such as Switzerland, Singapore, and Qatar, whose foreign policy is grounded in the principle of neutrality and favors more or less like a hedging strategy on many issues. For example, trying to create 1,000 friends and no enemy. At the same time, being criticized, Bangladesh's foreign policy making has also been criticized for that it might be punching below its belt, because the neighborhood expects more from Bangladesh with its more calibrated approach to foreign policy for a more firm stand on the regional issues. At that point, it seems to be not taking a stand in the regional scenario. I would like to say that the scenario in which Bangladesh's foreign policy, neighborhood policy is working right now is the potential for great power in South Asia that stand on how to deal with the Islamic world, which is over the years has been just based on aid and remittances dependent. So it has to redefine its engagement with the Islamic world. And thirdly, apart from now, it has to move from merely seeking recognition in the post-independent era to having a more having an independent stand among the increasing economic integration in the region. Now, when we talk about Bangladesh's foreign policy, uh, in the neighborhood, there is emerging Indian tendencies, there is rising China, then there is more assertive Myanmar, and also the Bangladesh is being India locked on three sides has put Bangladesh in a kind of dilemma situation where it presents lot of opportunities as challenges for the leadership. Now, here at one point, Bangladesh can, try to think of leveraging the economic benefits from all these neighbors, from the rising economic growth of the neighborhood countries, and at the same time can be apprehensive about the intentions of the leaders of these countries. And the worry can be extended in the South China Sea, which has become the hotspot of the major actors of South Asian region. Now, over the years, if we consider, Bangladesh has been considered as wedged between the geography of between India and Myanmar, and has not been able to take the advantage of the geographic location of it. And when you all know then that when logic of geography does not work out, then the logic of the test ground for the diplomacy of a country, then the economic leverages come in, right? So right now, the country basically is following the policy of economic diplomacy in its neighborhood policy. Scholars like Shafiullah Hassan, Professor Haq, Professor Rashid, Professor Muhammad Uddin, they have all been focusing on emphasizing or putting an emphasis on the economic diplomacy to dig up the geostrategic problems which are there in the foreign policy making process, and to focus more on the rising multilateralism in the region. Now, scholars such as Professor Uddin have emphasized that the neighborhood foreign policy has to be more focused now on the manpower export or on the trade in services with regard to ODA, development assistance. For Bangladesh's foreign policy, it has become a mandatory responsibility to ensure or to secure a constant flow of its manpower export. If there is constant flow of manpower export, constant flow of remittances is going to happen, and which is going to sustain the forming of the foreign policy. It will also help to mobilize inward FDI, to get more of modern technological know-how, and to go beyond the last decades development, which was considered as mere a surprise of Bangladesh or a Bangladesh conundrum, to have a more of a stable foreign policy, to have a more of a stable foreign economic policy. Now, when we talk about, Bangladesh, so I will be focusing on Myanmar, China, and India. If we look at Bangladesh relations, after 4 years, the peaceful settlement of Bangladesh-Myanmar maritime dispute in the Bay of Bengal in 2012 had facilitated the economics of the bilateral relation. And the second point which encouraged the cooperation was the victory of Myanmar's pro-democratic leader in 2011. So these 2 points have changed the contours of the relationship between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Now, the first variable which I'm going to take is religion. As we all know, that identity being the fundamental of the religion. Thus, the Rohingya issue has shaped the contours of the foreign policy making between Bangladesh and Myanmar. The 7th century Arab Muslim traders settled in the Rakhine state since the days of the Mamul Ul dynasty, and the immigrants of the Chittagong area. The Rohingya Rohingyas share cultural and physical similarities with the Bangladeshis, and therefore there has been this large exodus of Rohingyas in the Bangladesh. Now, I myself visited Cox's Bazar area in the last in before 3 months, and I myself went to Cox's Bazar. I saw the situation of the Rohingya population there, where women are people are living at least 8 people are living in one room, and women have to produce a lot of kids under the pressure of their male of the family to ensure that the ethnicity of Rohingyas is going on, and there is larger population of the Rohingyas to ensure that. Now, Bangladesh, there is this resentment among the strategic community of the Bangladesh that none of the countries in its neighborhood has been able to take or understand the Rohingya issue from Bangladeshi perspective. And Bangladesh, also being a small nation state, is under international community, feels pressure of international relations to ensure the safety and security of the Rohingyas, while at the same time keeping the cost of administration or keeping the cost of keeping Rohingyas in their own country, on their own land. So, and they have not been able to raise voice, and none of the nations in neighborhood have been able to support them on the issue. That has been a major cause of resentment. Another issue is that International Crisis Group has given this report recently that there is emergence of Harkal al-Yaqin Group, ARSA, ARSA, which is known to mobilize the Rohingyas on the lines of radicalization. And if we talk about all this, that is how religion has shaped the foreign policy making. And if we look at the same issue economically, because of the Rohingya issue, the Bangladesh-Myanmar economic relations are at a stall. The projects such as Asian Highway, Pulling Connection, which is to pass through Rakhine State, are at loggerhead.
Anjali, 1 minute.
Oh, yeah, ma'am. So because of the non-resolvement of the issues. Now, in the same way, if we talk about India-Bangladesh relations, historically, India-Bangladesh relations have been religion-oriented because of the larger cultural and historical linkages. But over the years now, they have become more of economic based. Even with regard to India, Bangladesh is focusing more on the economy. In the same way, when we talk about China-Bangladesh relations, historically, it was General Irshad who started to have relations with kind of anti-India stand. But now it is moving to economy, more of economy, and lot of bilateral projects. For example, BRI. Now China considers Bangladesh important because it is the single country, Muslim country, which can be a good partner to China and to solve the issue of UBR population in China. And more importantly, China can show itself as the friend of the Muslim nation states in the world fora. And the only way in which China has to ensure from religion to economy, it has shifted is in the form of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, in which China just has to show the tainted image of BRI to be that it is going to trap the Bangladesh in debt. It has to move away and show it to Bangladesh that into the way for, and in the way eventually I would like to conclude that it is the economic diplomacy. Earlier over the years it was the social, political and cultural linkages also, but right now the Bangladesh's foreign policy making in the neighborhood is moving towards the economic diplomacy. So thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you. I think after 2 papers on Bangladesh, I should be seeing some questions on Bangladesh, as it were. I can't really see too many here. Anyways, I think the participants are still sort of mulling over and taking in the presentations that you and Hoymonti have given already. I urge the participants to have questions, as many as possible, because now we are on to our last speaker, who's Surabhi. Surabhi, welcome. Surabhi is going to speak on federal imperatives of Indian India Conventions, it is Ganges and Teesta River water sharing. Surabhi, I welcome you on behalf of NIICE, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us. You're the last speaker, but we have enough time, so don't worry about that. After 10 minutes, I will again just raise my pen and say that, maybe 2 more minutes to wind up if at all you need them. Surabhi is from Sardar Patel University of Police. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Chair. I hope I'm audible enough. Good evening, Chair, and all the attendees. Thanks, organizers, for giving me this opportunity to present my paper on federal imperatives in India's neighborhood policy, a comparative study of Ganges and Teesta River Agreement. As we all know that India and Bangladesh share largely cordial relations on river water sharing. River water sharing is very crucial for the food and water security of Bangladesh. At the same time, there are 4 common rivers, and Bangladesh is lower riparian for all these rivers. Besides India's northeast growing domestic demands for agriculture and hydropower generation have played a very important role in directing the India-Bangladesh discourse on river water sharing to a large extent. As we know that India, the states of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Tripura, and West Bengal shares borders with Bangladesh, and therefore any kind of transboundary river sharing agreement will have a lasting impact on their geography, demography, and resources to a large extent. And therefore, we see that river water sharing has become a contested in Indian state, and the fate of it has been determined to a large extent by the federal politics of India. So I'm going to compare and contrast the entire treatment and the process of arriving at the treatment of Ganges River Water Agreement vis-a-vis Teesta. I'll start with Ganges. The Ganges is the most important transboundary river for Bangladesh, and the genesis of this problem dates back to 1961, even before the creation of Bangladesh, when the Farag barrage construction started, and even before the barrage construction was completed, the issue began to surface in the domestic politics of both the countries. And in 1972, Joint River Commission was constituted, JRC was constituted to look into the matter. In 1975, river agreement for 5 years was concluded, which regulated the flow of water for dry lean season for 5 years. And the main issue of Bangladesh continues to withdraw water unilaterally to the detriment or to the against the interest of the lower riparian Bangladesh. At the same time, India claims that Bangladesh has overstated its water claims, and there is general feeling, especially among the states of India, that they are not taken into consideration while any negotiation is being done. So this issue has become highly politicized and become a matter of domestic debate in both, especially in India, which has made the intergovernmental negotiations largely difficult. Finally, 1996 was a very historic time when the regimes of both India and Bangladesh changed. In Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina-led government, Awami League government came to power, and in India, non-Congress coalition government came to power under the leadership of Deve Gowda, IK Gujratar of India. Negotiations resumed soon after, and we find that the negotiations started at foreign secretary level, and Bangladesh foreign secretary visited India, and on the suggestion of IK Gujratar, he met Jyoti Basu. The most important thing during this period was that left front government was ruling the state of West Bengal, which was a coalition partner, which was an important partner or coalition partner of the center. And therefore, Jyoti Basu, he facilitated to a large extent the conclusion of the Ganges River Treaty. So the foreign secretary level talks resumed, and Bangladesh foreign secretary first met Jyoti Basu and approached Jyoti Basu to find an amicable solution to this problem, and he assured that he would do everything possible to find an amicable solution to this problem. And in fact, Bangladesh Bangladesh from 27 November to December 2nd, 1996. And this period of became very crucial because he helped in significantly narrowing the differences between the two sides. He held wide-ranging discussions with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh and the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. And finally, we find a joint committee of experts after looking into the technical issues. And while these political negotiations were underway, drafted an agreement which was agreed upon by both the sides. And we find a 30-year Ganges Water Agreement successfully reached in this agreement. So the main issue is that how the entire negotiation of West Bengal, Jyoti Basu Radha became the chief negotiator for this entire dispute, which has been lingering on for so many years. It was his 6-day visit, which to Bangladesh, that the draft of Ganges Water Agreement was finalized, and it was by of India coach. Besides other economic incentives which were given. So I want to compare that how did this soft attitude of Jyoti Basu and compare and contrast with the stubborn attitude of Mamata Banerjee, which has kept the Teesta issue on the back burner. Then when I come to Teesta River issue, Teesta River, it originates in the Sikkim, flows through the northern part of West Bengal, enters into Bangladesh, and then merges into Brahmaputra. So it's an important river both for the 53% population of the West Bengal basin, and at the same time it's very important for the rice production of Bangladesh. So Teesta issue since till up till 1996 rather, singular attention was given only to Ganges water dispute. Only 1983 Teesta River dispute of 39% to India, 36% to Bangladesh, and the remaining 25% was kept unallocated. Then finally, we find that after the Ganges settlement took over, Teesta issue was given attention by the Joint River Commission, and in 2010, JRC hosted a meeting in Dhaka, and Bangladesh reiterated an arrangement which had proposed long back, in which it had wanted to allocate 40% of the water both to India and to Bangladesh, and remaining 20% to be kept as a reserve, which is minimum e-flow, which is widely accepted international principle to keep the minimum water during the dry season to maintain the river and the ecosystem. The then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2011, September 2011, plated with Bangladesh along with the West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee, but her last-minute refusal to accompany, protesting against the changes made in the agreement, which she neither approved of nor was allegedly informed of. So she backed out from the delegation, and this gave a big jolt to India-Bangladesh Water Cooperation. Despite strong historical and cultural ties with Bangladesh and her pro-Muslim appeasement policy, the Bangladesh Banerjee-led government was clear in opposition to the Teesta River Agreement. She was against any 40-40-20 arrangements, and her argument was that it would harm the interests of the North Bengal, and Teesta is vital to the 5 major districts of West Bengal: Cooch Behar, Jalpaiguri, South and North Dinjapur, and Darjeeling. And this was the stated reason, but the underlying reason was that there is that giving more share of Teesta to Bangladesh can hurt her, and her Mamata Banerjee and her party are not politically influential in North Bengal constituency. And since she wanted to consolidate not this
1 minute.
Okay. So I just wanted to compare that how does though water and agriculture is a state subject, but entering into foreign treaties, transboundary river agreement is completely under the purview of the union government. But we know that in reality the situation is different. In real political coalition space, nothing can be done without the consent of the state, especially when any such kind of agreement will have social economic impact on the basin state. Therefore, we find that India-Bangladesh relations have been hijacked to a large extent by the state politics of India and provincial, and we should not let the provincial interest harm our national interest in the long run. India-Bangladesh share a kind of fraternal relationship of we, if possible, the central government should try to make adjustments and compromises in the long run for smooth India-Bangladesh relations. And we find that in the same way, like Mamata Banerjee, despite at that time the compulsion was that UPA government was dependent on the Trinamool Congress for its survival in the parliament. But even we see Modi, Narendra Modi-led government, which has strong constitutional backing and enjoys complete majority, is not able to push forward the much-awaited deal just because nobody wants to antagonize the state government, especially when they have ideological and political differences. So nothing can be done, though foreign international river agreement, foreign entering into foreign treaties is completely the sole prerogative of the union government as per the constitutional provisions. But in real politics, the central government cannot ignore the interests of the. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Surabhi. Okay, so as we come to the end of presentations by all the panelists, I would just like to put out 2 thoughts on the table, and then we'll just begin with question and answer session. All the papers that have been presented basically touched upon various aspects of South Asia, including the internal aspects, the internal local governance aspect of Pakistan, 3 papers on Bangladesh, 1 paper on Afghanistan, and actually 2 papers which basically provide an overarching theme or background to South Asia, say para-diplomacy. I mean, Anna's paper touched upon Asia as a whole in that sense. And also we had Jigyasa, who was looking at non-traditional security threats from across the globe, but then both the papers had a sort of South Asian perspective, if you will, in that sense. So looking at a connecting thread that is there in this entire panel is very interesting and important. And I think that connecting thread tells us what we can do in terms of sustained conversations in future, because we know that South Asian countries are basically right now taking dramatic steps to counter the outbreak of COVID-19. And this is a situation across the globe, but South Asia as a region, can it rise to that kind of challenge? Because the economic toll that has been there at the center stage of this particular crisis, as lockdowns have affected hundreds and millions of people across these countries, leading to widespread factory closures and layoffs. These South Asian countries need to come together to sort of have a sense of collective response, because the pandemic is not really a national pandemic, it's an international pandemic in that nature. So can a region respond to this kind of international pandemic? The question that was needed, and we know that the government leaders have sort of responded to the kind of crisis that has been there for various reasons. So if you look at the example of Asian financial crisis, even that kind of crisis generated a kind of collective response from Southeast Asia. So in that sense, today we don't have a financial crisis only, we have a financial, human security, a non-traditional threat in the sense of a health crisis, economic crisis, and all kind of crises therefore which accompany these. So there is an urgent need for a kind of intervention which this situation has heightened, in the sense of both giving us manifold dangers, but also providing us with a possible framework of opportunities and certain accountability mechanisms that perhaps this particular region can come up with if as commons in this particular region. So I'll just stop here and I'll try to look at the questions that are there in the chat box already. I might have a couple of questions which I'll reserve for the end or for wrapping up the session, as it were. But I'll first try to address all the questions that are there in the chat box. And I'll begin with Shraddha Rishi, because I think there have been 2 questions directed to her. Shraddha, are you with me? And I'll just request all the panelists to at least switch on their videos, and as and when questions are directed to them, they can just unmute themselves and respond to the questions. Yeah, thank you so much. So Shraddha, there's a question for you. What are the parameters of declaring a state to be a failed state? If it is economy parameter, then most of the states in the world are struggling with their economy, be it India or just having economic parameter for a failed state, is that enough? That's first question. And I'll also give you the second one. I think it's there in chat box, but I'll just read it out for you. What do you mean by golden periods of democracy, and how do you see military interferences in Pakistan politics? Yeah, Shraddha.
Yes, ma'am. So the first question was, what can be the parameters of declaring a state as a failed state? So if we want to answer this question, we can see the concept, how the state came into being with the obligation to fulfill the security and welfare of its citizen. So I can say that the parameters of declaring a failed state would be if a state fails to fulfill the obligations put on it, be it in the form of providing security to the people or welfare to the people or of if it fails to fulfill these basic parameters, basic obligations, and the obligations imposed in the constitution of a country, so it can be declared, it can be labeled as a failed state. And I guess that the economy cannot be the only parameter. There can be other aspects also. The second question was, what do you mean by the golden period of democracy? I use this phrase in case of Pakistan only, when like it was a phase when the first time it was seen in case of Pakistan, the first civilian government handed over to the another civilian government. In the case of like it happened in 2012, and before it never happened in the history of Pakistan. And one by one there was the intervention of military. However, we cannot see the disappearance of military's intervention. Military's influence is there already in form on many institutions, not only in military. Military is dominating, I can say, every aspects of social life. So it was the golden period of democracy, meant that we can see as an optimistic sign that it can be a gradual strengthening of democracy in Pakistan.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Shraddha.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Shraddha. There's a question to Anna from Dr. Hem Kusum, who teaches Chinese at Shanti Niketan. The question is that in case of Macau, we see that a stronger center has been able to facilitate decentralized international cooperation. However, in South Asia, we see the democracies with federal characteristics have not been very successful in promoting such cooperation. So, according to you, what is holding back?
The fact is that Professor Hem Kumar has rightly said that China, though looks like a dictatorial, it's a dictatorial regime, yet has allowed that kind of autonomy to Macau in terms of a lot of areas by certain laws. In terms of democracies in South Asia and Asia also, I'm mostly taking South Asia and taking India by example, and other places in South Asia like Sri Lanka and others. But in case of India also, when it's a federal system, yet the government, the national government has not been, not facilitated that kind of autonomy, because maybe power is what they feel is absolute, or they do not want to decentralize. So there's a lot of talk, but that is not in practice. So I think there is some kind of talk, propaganda, there is some kind of practice. So the theory and praxis do not go in South Asia. So the governments are writing, the governments are promoting, the government in India is actually creating a lot of projects. But then whenever the state government, it's the entire debate that we as political scientists have read, the union state cooperative and conflict federalism. And it's by and large going on, the debate is going on forever, that cooperative federalism is always compromised. And conflict and, the differences between state and that can also be because of the election and party model and the question of power itself. So I think South Asian, because of growth that they say, it's quite individualistic, or maybe the growth is becoming narrow in the way of how they're taking it. And in terms of China, China does, though China wants to acquire all the power, but I think China is also looking at to extend, and there China allows bit of autonomy, playing on certain advantages. Like in case of Macau, also it played on the advantage that it had on cultural and other advantage, and trying to see that how China becomes a leading nation in Asia. In South Asia, is not able to do so. Even if it talks about being the leading nation, it always gets limited by its own roadblocks. So I think power and the concept of federalism is not taken seriously in India, the shared power.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. This next question for Hoymanti from Bharat Kumar. The question goes as follows. What are the government policies that have been adopted by tackling the cyclones and flood affected areas in Bangladesh? What are the effects people from marginalized community are facing because of the pandemic and natural calamities? If you have any reports that you can quote in that particular regard. Hoymanti.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah. So a lot of talk has been on in the IPCC and the recent the COP21 meeting that has been talking continuously about how to mitigate all these problems. And but then the COP21 has been a major failure on many grounds, because whatever was promised, I mean, like to follow the sustainable development and to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions, jointly by all the countries. All these things have not been what was decided in the COP21 has not been addressed globally. So it becomes very difficult for Bangladesh singularly to take care of such a massive problem and come up with policies, because as I mentioned, that these problems are interrelated and nothing can be done single-handedly at a regional level, because the problem is not regional. The problem is international. The Paris climate meetings, if they fail to come to fulfill what has been listed to mitigate the issues, then it becomes very difficult for smaller countries like Bangladesh to single-handedly take care of the problem. And regarding the marginalized, when it comes to flooding and the the water bank, river bank erosion in Bangladesh, nothing remains as a marginalized. It is not based. It is not singularly about the marginalized people, because all these people who are going through such massive loss and damage are actually those communities who had property, who had jobs, and who had their own houses. But these people, upon getting their houses, ultimately become the marginalized society, and they move to the urban areas. So there is a very thin line out here when we call who's the marginalized and who's being affected. Because if I talk about the Rohingyas, they are the migrants and they are the refugees in the country. But when it comes to coastal flooding, it is not only the Rohingyas who are getting affected. It is the normal people who are not the refugees. They are also becoming refugees and ultimately becoming the marginalized in the country. And do we have any other questions? If I missed something?
No, Hoymanti, there's a common question for people who presented on Bangladesh. So I'll just try to read out Shraddha's question to Surbhi, and then we'll deal with that question, which is to all the presentations on Bangladesh. Question from Shraddha. States be given the say over the transboundary rivers. How will it affect the federal structure in India, and what are the constitutional provisions in that regard?
As per the constitutional provisions, water is a state subject. At the same time, agriculture is also a state subject. But Article 253 of the Indian Constitution clearly places transboundary river agreement under the purview of the Union list. Besides, entry 10 and 14 in the Union list also puts foreign affairs and treaty making power as the in the Union subject. But any kind of transboundary river agreement will have a lasting impact on the demography, and will have social, economic, and demographic impact on the river basin, and at the same time will have a lasting impact on the resource sharing. So also does puts does not make it obligatory for the center to consult the state, but the central government cannot afford to ignore the interests of the state government, both in real politic terms, at the same time, ideologically also and ethically also, the state governments need to be consulted into any matter which will affect their resource sharing.
I would like to add something, if it's possible.
Yeah.
I think one of the someone asked me if there are any reports. I would just like to suggest that. Yeah. So there are many reports. It's not possible that I give one or two names, but however, ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the think tanks like IP, CPRG, Center for Research and work on climate change and the climate justice, and they have been doing a phenomenal work. So you can follow their work and their articles and their videos, because a lot, it's very informative, and I think it should help.
I would like to mention here one thing, that state government of West Bengal constituted a Rudra Kalyan committee to look into the nitty-gritty of the West Bengal demand. But so far, the committee's reports have not been made public, and this shows some kind of underlying politics or larger politics behind this sharing with Bangladesh. And being lower riparian, Bangladesh will always be psychologically in a disadvantageous position, and it's the responsibility of India, being a bigger neighbor and an upper riparian, to look into the basic needs and minimum requirements of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Surabhi. Thank you, Mandeep. All the things presented on Bangladesh in South Asia, and I think also Jigyasa, if you want to come in between and answer the first part of the question, which is that in South Asia, the grounds for collaboration among South Asian countries was majorly non-traditional security. However, in the past few years, traditional security is much more of a framework in terms of basically dealing with just the two questions of terrorism and ethnicity. So if in case Jigyasa, you want to answer that question, and then we move on to the next question to the panelists on Bangladesh papers dealing with different aspects of Bangladesh. I'll read out that question as well. So between the three of you who presented on Bangladesh, you might want to sort of come after one another and maybe address this question one by one. I leave it up to you as to who wants to go first and who wants to go last. Okay. So the question is, do you think as a danger to India in terms of security and its partnership with China, and will that spoil India's growth story? Yeah, so the three of you who presented on Bangladesh, please decide amongst themselves as to who goes first. Jigyasa, yeah.
Oh, okay. So your question is actually very valid. That yes, in past few years we have been saying that yes, traditional security is actually coming up again. But when we're talking about the whole structure of SOC, can we revamp it? If you see what is the major obstacle or the major hindrance currently, which has been, just the main reason why SARC is not able to come together is again the same problem of terrorism. Again, coming out from the non-traditional threat. For example, India and Pakistan. They have a rivalry, and that is the main reason why SARC is not able to come together. Secondly, even if we are planning to revamp SARC, can we actually ensure that SARC has not been very effective, specifically in terms of the political structures, specifically also regarding the security aspect. So can we actually think of it? And if I just limit myself to the issues of extremism, we have seen that there's a particular provision in the SARC which talks about the internal security aspect, that you cannot actually interfere in the sovereignty of the other state. And we have seen that all the statement is coming out from the South Asian state. For example, in case of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, they have mentioned that yes, all the cases of extremism and radicalization are internal issues. So if they are basically saying that yes, it's my internal issue, so how can you come and how you can't just interfere in that? That could be one of the issues that become problematic. I guess yes, I guess these are the main things that I will confine myself to. So maybe yes, we can revamp SARC, SAARC, same thing, all the India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they have actually moved towards other international treaties and agreements. For example, India has already moved to SCO and other, other engagements. So I don't know whether even if we are going to revamp SAARC, so we have to actually start with the very scratch. So what would the future of SAARC is still in doubt. So, yeah.
Okay, Jigyasa, thank you. Anjali, you haven't spoken, so I invite you first, and then maybe Homanti and Surabhi can sort of come after that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Yeah. So the first question was about the reviving of SARC. I think it's definitely the need of the hour because it is one institute which will be exclusive of Chinese interest and exclusive of China being there. And we can all have a South Asian strategy or we already have a lot of religious and cultural. Therefore, Pakistan on board with everyone because Pakistan is it has been roadblock in the successful implementation of SARC negotiations mostly. And but I definitely see SARC revitalization of SARC in the coming up times, and maybe present governments of all the countries can take up some initiative and bring everyone together. The second question was about if India can be, if Bangladesh can be a threat to the India's growth story. I really don't think so because it's still India. Bangladesh is very much dependent on India for basic necessities, for the food items, for example. So even if Bangladesh has become even if China has become the largest trading partner of Bangladesh, still India, Bangladesh depends, and there has been a goodwill of long time. There has been a historical goodwill of the support given in the Bangladesh liberation struggle. And still, they are trying to be a middle income country by 2021. That is their target. So even to be a middle power in the region, they need lot of effort in the coming up time. And still there is lot of poverty in Bangladesh, despite lot of it's and the economy being lot of aid dependent. It makes Bangladesh lot of fragile to the world economic environment. So I would say that no, Bangladesh cannot be a threat to the Indian growth story. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. I cannot help but intervene because I mean I don't know. I have to point. The story is not all that one-sided. It's not about how Bangladesh continues to be dependent on India. In fact, if you read most of the economic indicators that have been there in South Asia, Bangladesh is doing actually the best among South Asian countries. And you know that HDI parameters, all the indices which tell us how good is the social capacity performance of South Asian countries. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are doing much better. And if you now come to the economic parameters as to how which countries are growing at a much better growth rate and everything, you know that Bangladesh is just a few spots behind India. And in terms of per capita income and so on and so forth, and the dependence part of it, the interdependence, as it were, is not one-sided. We are as much dependent on Bangladesh in terms of the way we have pitched our stakes in Bangladesh economy. As to bring in one country which we've not really discussed, which is Bhutan. So if the conventional sense of the things would be that given the size of Bhutanese economy, and given the size of Indian economy, one would just come to that kind of conclusion that Bhutan is not that kind of independent economy. It depends a lot on India and so on and so forth. But if you just look at the number of migrant laborer workers who are going to Bhutan every day to get their per day income, and you look at how many Bhutanese are coming to India for that kind of a per day income, generation of per day income, the story is completely reversed in last 1 decade. So these are some of the indicators that we need to look at in terms of when we say that there is some kind of dependence by one party or one interacting unit, as it were. I think the story of the interaction has changed something like other panelists who've spoken on Bangladesh would want to sort of also bring in this aspect. Thank you so much. Having said that, I really enjoyed your paper, and I'm looking forward to the responses by Moimanti and Surabhi in that regard. Thank you.
Okay, so first, adding to Anjali, and also you have rightly mentioned about Bangladesh development. I think what we have to understand is if Bangladesh is ready or not. But I feel that if Bangladesh wants to challenge India at this point of time or not, when they are actually, their goals are developmental completely. First. Second, they are following a kind of, not a kind of, but they're following the goodwill relationship with India and rest of the neighborhood, and also peace. You know, they are following their neighbors. So, as you have rightly mentioned, Bangladesh is doing extremely well. There is our goals are very developmental. So, at this point of time, challenging India or any other countries in the region would not be the best of the decisions. That is the second question. And going to the first one, if SARC can be revamped or not, I feel SARC is already a failed story. Trying to, there have been a lot of talks on SARC. There have been a lot of meetings on SARC, and just in the beginning of the COVID, there was a big international meeting by all the head of the state. You know, India came on board and Bangladesh was there, but it stopped in that meeting, and nothing goes forward. So at this point of time, SARC not fulfilling what it is supposed to. Yeah, I think I'll just add up. I had one point in my mind. I just forgot. Maybe I can add it after Surabhi finishes.
Surabhi, are you with us?
Point.
Surabhi, can you hear us? Okay. Since there is another question, I'll just move on to that, and if Surabhi comes back, we'll try to ask her also to sort of pitch in. There's a question by Bharat Kumar. Okay, so there's some kind of cross-referencing about ILO and all. I think we can just I'll move on to the second part of that question. Regarding marginalized community, we cannot see a thin line between who's marginalized and who's not, because the community who's already suffering comes under such community with all by the pandemic or by natural calamity, they become more marginalized. So there is a need to think more sensitively and rationally regarding who is a marginalized community, which is a point well taken, absolutely well taken. And Hem Kusum has another question regarding the way, you know, in the area of women's rights, considering with Muslim women, Bangladesh is far ahead. So she's just making one point. She doesn't really have a question. And then how, you know, the dependent migrant thing that I had picked up, I think there's another point of intervention by Hem Kusum regarding the same, that a lot of migrant workers from Bihar and Bengal are actually dependent on neighboring countries like Bhutan and also Bangladesh. So one has to think about that in that sense. Do we still have Surabhi with us? I don't think so. I can't. Either visible or she's on mute. So,
can I add one point? I'll just finish what I was saying regarding SARC. SARC will not be revamped until and unless all the South Asian countries begin to trust each other. You know, bringing Pakistan on board, it's a distant dream right now. We have to resolve our problems first. And what is happening with Nepal? SARC is absolutely a full-formed. It was a full-formed organization which we could not put into good use. And this can happen. First, we have to resolve our own differences, and then we can approach, you know, SARC to mitigate our regional problems regarding traditional security or non-traditional security. That's all.
True, very true. So all that is left for me is actually to just sort of thank everyone here. And I really enjoyed all your presentations. And it's actually a feat because for the last 2 hours we've been looking at diverse aspects, as it were, and one could listen to all of them in one go. And each paper made us think little bit more about that area. And I hope that such conversations continue in future. For that, it's also on the behalf of all the panelists that I would like to thank NIICE. And I can see Sumitra here who has joined us. So thank you so much, Sumitra, for having all of us on the same platform. Only thing is that now I'll have to go back and see the other sessions as to what unfolded there, because there's also a parallel session. So I'll also urge all the participants to just check out what happened in the next session as well. Thank you so much. Once again, I would like to stress upon the point that we need to have these kind of conversations on a sustained, in a sustained manner.